Thank you so much. So now, turning back to our paper speakers, I believe the next speaker of the evening is Professor Robert Wade. Professor Robert Wade has been educated in both New Zealand and Washington, DC, and has published a number of books, including Irrigation and Politics in South Korea. Professor, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I'm going to pay particular attention to this word still in the title, in the motion. This House believes the global economy is still an imperial system. And I'm going to propose there are three indicators of an imperial system as distinct from, that is to say, an informal imperial system, not a colonial one, as distinct from a non-imperial system. And the first indicator is to do with rules of the world economy. And this indicator of an imperial system suggests that the imperial countries, in this case the West, or the core countries of the world economy, set rules, international rules, for the world economy, such that developing countries are put under great pressure to practice free trade and free capital mobility. So those are the rules in which developing countries engage in the international economy, practicing close to free trade and free capital mobility. In other words, no capital controls, no controls on the inflow and outflow of capital, or no controls on the inflow and outflow of foreign firms. That's the first indicator. The second indicator is, which sort of follows on, is that one finds very large net resource flows, income flows, wealth flows from the global south to the West as a result of these countries, the global south, practicing free trade and free capital mobility. And so the question is, what is the magnitude of these resource flows from south to the West, which then sustain the prosperity of the West? Thank you very much, including Cambridge. And number three, the third indicator, is simply that there are, and this is implied in what I just said, there are persistent, very large average income gaps across decades of time between countries, regions. I'll be talking of regions of the global south, like 7 or 8 regions, and the average income of the north. So that's the ground that I want to cover. And I'll begin with this point about the rules of open capital accounts. So I'm now going to talk just of the capital account of developing countries rather than capital and the trade account. I'm leaving out the trade account, although there are big resource transfers that come through the trade account, as in theories of, quote, unequal exchange. I'm talking now just about the capital account. So the point is that the US, the IMF and the World Bank, which the IMF and the World Bank operate as arms of US foreign policy, have pressed developing countries to deepen their financial integration into the global financial system over the past 30 years, going back indeed more than 30 years into the 1980s, to deepen their financial integration into the global economy. And in particular, they've worked hard, the US, the World Bank, the IMF, the UK government, other governments, other Western governments have worked hard to persuade or to force developing countries to open their capital accounts, that is, to remove controls on capital flows across their borders or restrictions on capital flows. And these Western countries promised developing countries easy riches, just as Professor Haskell did in his talk, easy riches, if they open their capital account in order to draw in foreign capital to supplement domestic investment. We'll come back to that point of easy riches. Did opening the capital account promote growth? Question mark. And at the same time as these Western countries push developing countries to open their capital account, those Western countries, especially the US, were also pursuing ultra-easy monetary policy. So developing countries were operating in an environment where they had no capital controls and in a world financial system where there was very easy access to cheap money, thanks to Western monetary policy led by the US Fed. So the combination of open capital accounts plus access to ultra-easy money has resulted in developing countries quickly increasing their gross external assets and liabilities. They've deepened their integration into the international financial system, thereby making themselves, this is the key point, making themselves particularly vulnerable to shocks coming from the West, such as big changes in US monetary policy, and I'll overrule that for the moment, thanks. And also making themselves vulnerable to imperial arm twisting. They have made themselves vulnerable to these shocks, these pressures, and therefore to arm twisting of their governments, which is in the spirit of the imperial project. So, in a word, by integrating so deeply into the international financial system, developing countries have been playing with fire, but they've been, in a sense, coerced into playing with fire. Now, let's come to this point about the easy riches. That is, if you open your capital account, you will grow faster. Larry Summers at the US Treasury promised Latin American countries in the 1970s that this would be the result. Well, we know what happened in Latin America. But the larger point is that sustained research has found very little evidence of positive growth effects from the opening of capital accounts. And I'm referring now to the research by, for example, Helena Ray, and separately, Jonathan Ostry and his colleagues at the IMF. So that's the point about rules. Now I want to come to the second indicator, which is an indicator of the magnitude of net resource transfers from the global south to the West. The key point here is this, that open capital accounts and flexible exchange rates in developing countries have helped to pave the way for very large-scale net resource transfers from developing countries to the West. And these resource transfers are in addition to those which come through the trade account, that is, through unequal exchange. One type of resource transfer through the capital account is a net flow, this is a flow, of capital income or investment income from developing countries to the West. This is the difference between what they earn on their gross external assets, such as, for example, their foreign exchange reserves held in US dollars, and what they pay on their gross external liabilities, what they pay, for example, on assets owned by foreign companies working in their country. So, in a word, developing countries accumulate low-yielding assets abroad, as in foreign exchange reserves, but also other kind of assets, and they have high-yielding liabilities that they have to pay to entities abroad, mainly in the West. So, just as an example, they may, developing countries are under great pressure to build large foreign exchange reserves, much of which they borrow, and they invest these often borrowed reserves in US treasuries, and they get maybe 3% rate of return on US treasuries. But meanwhile, foreign companies investing in equities and direct investment in their country are getting rates of return of, let's say, 20%. And that difference constitutes a net transfer of investment income from developing countries to the West. Yes?
If they could only earn 3% by investing their money abroad, why wouldn't they also invest it in themselves, 12% or whatever the foreigners are getting? Presumably, if they've got the money, why not invest in themselves?
Well, it's a good question. Why don't they invest in themselves? And the short reason, oh my goodness, the short reason is because they have open capital accounts, number one. Number two, open capital accounts make them very vulnerable to great inflows and outflows of capital. And to handle those vulnerabilities, they build up very large foreign exchange reserves on which, instead of investing in their own country, they get very low returns. I have to speed this up. So let me go now to two studies which actually calculate the magnitude of net investment income transfer from the global south to, or very large developing countries like the developing countries in the G20, to Western countries, especially the US, the UK, Germany, and Japan. So Yilmaz Akgüz is one who's done this work. Also, by the way, UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, has done this work. But Akgüz calculates that the emerging economies in the G20, that's 11 of them, have transferred to advanced economies an average of 2.3% of their combined GDP per year. Every year, they've transferred an amount equal to 2.3% of their combined GDP to the West, and especially to those four Western countries I mentioned, the US, UK, Germany, and Japan. Jörg Meyer does a similar calculation and comes to basically the same conclusion. It's around about 2 to 3% of the combined GDPs of these developing countries that gets transferred every year. Okay, so this is my last point, which is to do with these sustained income gaps. I'm not going to be talking about gaps within countries, inequality within countries. I'm just talking, this is really crude, and we were forbidden to show slides, so I'm going to hold up this chart. This chart, let me explain. On the horizontal axis, it goes from 1970 through till today. On the vertical axis, it shows the percentage of each region's average GDP as a percentage of that of the North from 1970 through till today. And immediately, if you understand that, you can see two very shocking things. I'm just coming to an end. Two very shocking things. One is that from 1970 through till today, there has been no catch-up. These lines are flat. That is, for each region, where it was in terms of the percentage of its average income relative to that of the North in 1970, it ends up today with pretty much the same percentage. There's been no convergence, no catch-up. And that's what you would expect in an imperial system. The imperial countries set rules for the international economies which ensure that they remain very substantially up above, in terms of income prosperity measures, those of the imperialized countries. Thank you.